Houston, loud and clear.
2584, runway 24 left, clear for takeoff.
Welcome aboard Leading Edge from aerospacenews.com. This episode, like all our podcasts and videos, is made possible by the generous support of our listener crew. Please join up by visiting aerospacenews.com/fans and make any contribution you can afford. Every bit of support helps, no matter how small. Thanks. Welcome to our very first episode of Leading Edge from aerospacenews.com, ARL, which stands for After Relaunch. We had a podcast back in the 2000s, and we are back. Well, I'm back, and I'm your host, Craig. Joining me today to get things off the ground is one of the most respected aerospace journalists in the world, an award-winning LA Bureau Chief and Senior Editor for Aviation Week and author of numerous books, Guy Norris. Welcome, Guy.
Thanks, Craig. Good to be with you.
We have a little history together, don't we, Guy?
Yes, we do. A bit of history. Well, are you going to start with this?
Well, hopefully nothing that'll embarrass either of us, but among the highlights, for me at least, were that we were on one of the world-proving flights of the A340. Was that not correct?
Yeah, that goes dates us a bit dramatically, doesn't it? But yes, it's true. Indeed.
We did a COD embark and overnight stay on the Nimitz-class carrier Carl Vinson, and we were both on the delivery flight of the 1,000th Boeing 747.
It's all true. It's all true.
It's all true. It's all horribly, terribly true. Okay, well, we've got a feature that hopefully everyone will enjoy to give the audience a little sense of our guests, a little more insight into them other than their curriculum vitae. And I'm calling it the lightning round. It's sort of our version of the fighter weapons school final exam, a la Red Flag or Top Gun. So it's a series of rapid fire questions. Don't need any explanation. Just give me the answer that comes to your head. Are you ready for that?
I'll go on then. Yeah. I'm ready.
Okay. Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Trek.
Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Okay, that's correct, by the way. Your go-to karaoke song?
It's definitely not Sweet Caroline. I'm not going to go beyond that.
Okay. Tolkien or Harry Potter?
Tolkien.
Okay. Have you ever been any kind of scout as a child?
No, just an air cadet.
No. Okay. Well, that's scout adjacent.
Okay.
Do you prefer domestic or imported beer?
Ooh, I'm a bit of a beer agnostic, actually. I'll drink virtually anything that's brewed.
Airplanes or helicopters? Which one do you like better?
Airplanes.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
That's a real... It used to be tea and now it's coffee. How about that?
Interesting. Okay. Well, I suspected as much. Extraterrestrial life or humans alone in the universe?
I think the ETs have my vote.
And here's one I'm suspecting you're going to have no trouble answering. Is the game properly referred to as football or soccer?
Oh, football. Sorry, it's the rest of the world wins on that one.
I thought so. Okay, that wasn't too painful, was it?
I'll tell you later.
Okay, off the air. I hope you're going to be back after that. So today we're going to talk about the Airbus A380, a plane many people will consider to simply be Airbus's answer to the Boeing 747. But one reason it's our topic is that on the day this podcast publishes, that's assuming all the stars are in alignment, which will be 27 April 2019, it will be the 14th anniversary of the Airbus A380's first flight on 27 April 2005. So, the Airbus A380 has an interesting future, in a manner of speaking. What was the business case, if there ever was one, for Airbus building the A380?
Well, all along, sort of Airbus knew that they had to their ultimate plan was always to fill out the family and compete with Boeing on every front. And it saw an opportunity with the 747, 747-400 had been relaunched essentially in the late 80s. And it saw an opportunity there that it really, if it was ever going to compete, this was the chance really to come up with something that would perhaps go slightly beyond the 747-400. So they saw that as an opportunity to fill out the family, and they sort of always really, the reasoning behind it was the fact that slot congestion at the major airports was definitely becoming a huge issue. And their sort of assertion was that what better solution, obviously continual growth in air transport is going to continue, so what better solution can you have than simply putting more people on one airplane that's going to take up one slot? So, that in a very simplistic manner, that was the argument that launched the A380.
Their marketing people didn't see the emerging trend, which was that the transoceanic routes were starting to be served by twin jets at the time, or was that really not obvious?
Well, of course, in hindsight, it was 100% obvious, but they were there was a sort of a split within Airbus internally. Of course, they had the A330 and A340 families, and they didn't want to actually cannibalize their own 340 efforts at the time by admitting that the world was going to big twin, medium twin, and that there was longer, thinner routes developing all over the world. And of course, what was really the problem for them was that Boeing was doing the job for them by launching the 777, of course.
Right.
777 had been, launched in the 90s, and they really didn't see, either they chose not to see it, or at that point they essentially thought, well, the evolution of air transport itself is driving us to these bigger and bigger aircraft. So even if we ourselves produce another series of profitable or economical twin jets, there'll still always be a place for this huge aircraft, because there's simply going to be a demand from the sheer number of people that are going to be flying.
The airplane itself had two power options, which I think is one fewer, if I'm not mistaken, than the 747 is usually enjoyed. Is my memory correct about that?
You mean in terms of the engine option that was available to... Yeah, well, don't forget, the original 747 was offered with all three engines from all three engine makers. And in fact, It was the 747-400 experience of certifying with all three that made Boeing say never again. We're never going to do that. And the 777,
okay.
Well, they did actually do it with the 777, but only on the 200 and the original 200. So ever since then, of course, Boeing has gone essentially wherever it can, sole source. 787, of course, only offered with two engine types. The 380, that was a really interesting situation, because at that time, GE and Pratt were both kind of almost exhausted by the experience of competing with each other for the Boeing models, and they basically mutually agreed that they would rather come up with a joint attempt to offer an engine, which is the resulting GP alliance, that the G for standing for GE and P for Pratt & Whitney. So that left it did end up as a two-engine option, with the new GP 7200 and Rolls-Royce offering the Trent 900. So very interesting how that actually evolved. And of course the two engine makers.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say the two engine makers were. It kind of caused quite an interesting competitive battle in terms of performance, but Rolls-Royce later on decided that they didn't meet Airbus's noise requirements, and that caused them a late redesign on their engine. They ended up having to increase the fan size, which did make it quieter, but made the fuel burn slightly less efficient. So It was an interesting trade-off as all this technology was coming together. They are still, of course, they do still represent, both of them, highly advanced, state-of-the-art engines for a decade ago, and of course, because of the subsequent rapid increase in technology, which was required and driven by the twin jets that were coming behind them, they were quickly obsoleted in a bizarre way. So, and that's part of the reason for the A380's, what people would say is suddenly its premature demise. But anyway, we can talk about that a little bit later.
Well, I hope the audience knows, if they're familiar with your work, that gas turbine technology is one of the areas where you are renowned as an expert. So I thought that would be a pretty interesting avenue to discuss. Do you have any sense, because I actually don't know, what the relative success and split was between the two suppliers on A380 in the existing fleet?
Well, off the top of my head, I can't tell you the split, but I do know that in terms of customer numbers, the Rolls-Royce had the edge in terms of operators, but in terms of overall numbers, the GP Alliance definitely got the lion's share, because one of its major customers for the bulk of the fleet was Emirates, which of course ended up operating the lion's share of the whole A380 fleet in the end. So I think that's, I think in the end, Emirates, would take. By the time they fulfill all of the final orders, there'll be 123 aircraft in their fleet, and the entire A380 fleet, when it's out there, the entire production aircraft, the tally will be 251. So almost exactly 50% of the entire delivered fleet has gone to one airline.
Wow.
Yeah, it says a lot about kind of where the A380 went right, but more about where it went wrong.
Sure. Did the GP 7200, the Engine Alliance offering, did that ever find a home in any other aircraft out there? None that comes to mind, but maybe I'm just uninformed.
No, you're right. It did. I mean, it was meant as a specific application for the A380, and as I said, it was a strange situation, really, because it combined I guess really the best of what they thought was the best of it had the G90's derived core. The low pressure sections came from Pratt & Whitney. So at the time it was very much a tailored engine solution for that airframe. But GE and Pratt really did go their separate ways after this. There was no chance really of a follow-on joint project, and this is perhaps the zenith of any sort of relationship between the two, certainly on the commercial world, and strange, sort of awkward bedfellows, to be quite honest. But technically, they did pull it off and did achieve a very, a solidly performing engine, which continues to do sterling work for the A380.
Yeah, I mean, the A380 itself has had a pretty exemplary safety record. We should also note, unless you want to correct me there, I know that there were two, oddly enough, sort of engine-related issues. One with the Rolls-Royce engine that was a bit more dramatic, and then I guess there was another one with the Engine Alliance powered aircraft as well, but that was considered fairly minor, if memory serves.
Right. Yes. I mean, of course, the biggest sort of or the most worrying incident, I suppose, was the Singapore Airlines. The Qantas Flight 32 incident, which happened at Singapore, which was to do with the Trent 900. Air France A380 had a lucky escape, I guess, when there was a fan detached from a GP engine en route over the North Atlantic, over Greenland, I think. So it's had its moments, but it's done okay, because I think part of the huge focus, as Boeing's was when they did the 747, was on making this aircraft as safe as possible, with multiple redundancies, and really sort of making it a very, very safe airframe.
Yeah, I guess my characterization of the Engine Alliance version being fairly minor was a bit inappropriate there. An uncontained engine failure is a pretty big deal, but I think what I was trying to get at was that the issue with the Rolls-Royce engine required a fleet-wide change to something to do with oil piping, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It was a significant event. But by and large, and you have to say, given the utilization of the fleet, I think, touch wood, I think it's done fairly well. It's kind of interesting when you look at the history of the A380, how, you kind of touched on it earlier, Craig. I mean, what went wrong really? Why did it flop essentially as a commercial product? And you do have to kind of look deeper into the DNA of the design itself to see that it really kind of shot itself in the foot to some extent. And I know this is a strange thing to say, but one of the things that Airbus had always been accused of was being a bit stingy when it came to the wings of its aircraft. They were always slightly smaller than they possibly could be, whereas they always looked across the Atlantic and saw that Boeing always built the wings slightly bigger than they needed to be in a general sense, and that when it came to stretching, because everything always ended up being derived and stretched again, the bigger wing was already there, so it was a huge factor. When it came to the A380, therefore, they deliberately designed in a larger wing, because they always assumed that there'd be a stretch Dash 900 coming afterwards. And because then the cargo version that was ordered as well, they basically built in a bit of structural weight to it to account for that. So the combination of a bigger wing and the heavier structure always meant that the baseline A380-800 didn't have that sort of optimal, was suboptimal essentially. It was always carrying around a bit more weight and a bit more wing than it needed to. And of course it also had a large tailplane, which would have also been needed for the stretch. So even if there was this talk a few years ago about re-engineering the 380, which would have brought it up to take advantage of the current generation of engines, this really meant it was almost a non-starter that have had so much redesign involved that it would have cost the Earth and really wouldn't have been worth it. It would have added to the overall debt that the program already carried over.
I see. Well, you touched on the freighter market a few times here, and we have, off camera, so to speak, had a chat about the configuration of the airplane and how it compared to its arch rival, the Boeing 747 freighter variants that have existed over the generations. And I was wondering if you could maybe shed some light on that. No one has ever seen a photograph, to the best of my knowledge, of the A380 sitting with its nose swung open, like we've seen so many shots of classic 747 freighters. You'd think a giant airplane like this would have a home in the freight world, and there was initially marketed and sold, if memory serves, some A380 freighters, but they canceled that program. Is that correct? And why did it never, forgive the turn of phrase, take off?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to remember that if you look back at, say, if you contrast the 380 with the 747, the 747, going way the heck back, emerged really out of all of the studies that Boeing had done for the aircraft that would eventually become the C5. For the U.S. Air Force's CX HLS competition in the early 60s. Right. So it was always optimized around using that sort of basis. They invented the concept of the wide body because they always had this single deck idea in mind, coming out of that CX study. And having conceived of the wide body, they thought, well, in the 60s, a lot of people really did believe that the world was going to be moving quickly to supersonic transports, and that their brand new 747 would soon be relegated to cargo duties. So they made it from the get-go compatible for a single deck, nose cargo loading, or even as a combi with side doors, always optimized around this single deck. So that was the preliminary starting point for the entire design. Contrast that with the A380, and the idea of the 380 having essentially begun by studies which mated two A340 fuselages side by side, that was quickly discounted. It was always driven by the passenger first, the passenger configuration. So when they eventually conceived of their own version of this wide body, it was really more a question of putting a new cross-section, a wide-body cross-section, with a 330, 340 cross-section sort of anchored to the top of it. So that cross-section, again, was optimized around two decks, which were both passenger decks. So it didn't have a nose loading option, never would do. And because of the overall deck configuration, it meant that whilst they could load parcels and containers for FedEx and UPS, of course, both of them did place orders initially for the freight version, it was always going to be slightly suboptimal compared to something which from day one had been designed with cargo in mind. And it would have been, I mean, they did have a workable concept, but I think when the time came, and Boeing, of course, came out with the 747-8 freighter, then clearly at that point, certainly as far as UPS was concerned, it was really not a question anymore. At the time, of course, when Airbus did, in fact, when the freighter was cancelled, it actually worked out in a way to Airbus's advantage, because they were able to quickly shift gears and accelerate production just of the passenger version only. So it looked for a while there, it was actually a win-win from that perspective. I think long term, though, it'll come back to haunt them. I think one of the questions you've got to ask is what's going to happen with the 380 fleets. And we may come to that in a few minutes. But, the idea of converting it into certainly an all-freighter configuration, which is often, the sort of twilight career, as we've seen for generations of jet airliners, I'm not quite, I don't really see that in the future for the 380. So it's an awkward one. And of course, the big thing Sorry, Craig, go ahead.
No, please continue.
Well, I was just going to say the big thing that we really, like the elephant in the room, really, when it comes to the raison d'etre of the 380, this idea of freeing up congestion, easing hub congestion. The super irony of it is that airlines themselves found that they were so worried about filling every single 380 flight, and they still are, of course, is that they actually have to contemplate additional feeder flights to make sure that every 380 is potentially filled up as it can get. So you're in fact contributing even more to congestion, because you're actually adding inbound aircraft to schedules to make sure you fill these things up. So
right,
it's something else to think about.
Well, if you were a betting man, would you bet on the value of a used A380 in 10, 15 years, or do you think they're going to be a bit of a red herring in the marketplace?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, you've got to look at what's happened so far. The early aircraft that have been retired and sold on to, to potential operators, I mean, it hasn't really worked out very well so far. And part of this is to be honest, is because of those early aircraft are not the best, in fact, in terms of performance, and there was a lot of lessons learned. And don't forget, Airbus, in fact, redesigned the wing quite early on into production, and so these were early build 380s that didn't have that benefit. But disregarding that, I think it's still going to be a hard sell. It may make an absolutely magnificent aircraft for really high capacity guaranteed charter loads. For example, Malaysia Airlines has been looking for better ways to use its aircraft and has been focusing them on its pilgrim charter operation, for the Hajj flights.
Right.
But opportunities like that are pretty limited, I think. Two are in the process of being scrapped, for example, which is, it's a sad fact. We've been saying a lot of kind of negative things about the aircraft. We're just being honest here. But, from a passenger perspective, I don't know. Have you had a chance to fly in it yourself very much?
Well, no, I didn't get any invitations from Airbus or any operating airlines like I did in the days when I was hanging out or associating with you, and no one's invited me along. But I've given some thought to flying on it, and one of the things that gave me pause for thought was just on a fully loaded airplane, the issue of getting out of it safely in the event of a unsuccessful operation, shall we say, a survivable event where there's lots of panicked people trying to get out of a fully loaded A380. But I'm sure what you're trying to do is introduce a characterization of the experience. I know there are tons of fans for this airplane,
right?
And
yes,
like you were saying, I'm not trying to dump on it here either. To be very, very clear. So tell me what your opinion was as a passenger.
Well, I've actually paid money to fly in it as a regular passenger. Just want to make that point. I have had a medium tour flight.
The horror.
Yes. In fact, one of my favorite memories is when Qantas brought across their A380, and they flew us up to San Francisco from LAX, just a very short flight. And captaining the flight was none other than their ambassador at the time, John Travolta. And we took off. We were flying north along the coast, beautiful day. And he came over the PA and he said, welcome aboard this flight. This is your captain, John Travolta. And we're with a wonderful crew with us today, led by our cabin services manager, Olivia Newton-John. And to our amazement, the two of them then proceeded to walk like royalty up and down the aisles, saying hello to everybody. So it was quite a strange but very enjoyable short flight. Anyway, I kind of digress. Neat. But the thing is that that the experience of flying on the aircraft is a very comfortable because of its size. Really, it really does absorb turbulence extremely well. It's a very smooth ride, and it's amazingly quiet. If you do have the chance to go on it, you'll be, I think, guaranteed. I'll be astonished at the low internal noise levels. So just a couple of points. And then you mentioned evacuation. One of our former colleagues that you and I both remember, who now works for Airbus, in fact, Kieran Daly, he participated in the EASA certification exit limit test for the A380 when they verified that 868 people could safely evacuate from the aircraft in darkness with half the exits closed and inoperable. I believe he jumped out of the top deck down one of those slides, so it can be done.
Wow. Well, he was actually foolhardy enough to go flying with me in a long easy once when he was out visiting in LA. So I'm not quite sure whether that's a validation or not of a safe evacuation.
Right.
But yeah, the airplane obviously was certificated, although we should take that with a bit of a grain of salt, because sometimes we learn things after systems are certificated or aircraft are certificated that we didn't know during that process. History is completely full of examples of that. But nonetheless, I think the A380 has certainly had a commendable safety record, and I would love an opportunity to fly on it. I remember that the A340 was also very quiet, and as you were describing how nice the cabin experience was, I was imagining between the design of the fuselage and the position of the engines under that massive wing, you probably did have a fairly quiet and soft ride, especially given the heft of the airframe and its relative resistance to being disturbed by meteorological phenomena, perhaps would be a way to describe that. I was noticing, even as I was doing some research on the story, that even the separation distances of an A380 behind another A380 were much shorter than any smaller, lighter aircraft would be behind an A380 for wake turbulence avoidance. And that says something about the A380 in trail, how resilient it is and resistant to being disturbed.
Right, of course. And of course, it's fly-by-wire system. Is of course that is state of the art. The aircraft itself, pioneered a lot of advances in that regard. It had a very high PSI, 5,000 PSI hydraulic system, which was 2,000 PSI higher than most hydraulic systems, commercial systems at the time. It brought in the use of these self-contained electrohydrostatic actuators that were used on the ailerons and the elevators. It had this backup hydrostatic actuator for the rudder, some of the spoilers. So, it did have it did introduce a lot of innovations, as well as not only it had the first commercial use, as far as I know, of this integrated modular avionics suite, this IMA, which had previously been just used on military aircraft. And structurally, of course, although it wasn't the level of composites that we see today with the 787 and A350, it did actually raise the bar on that. They used a lot of this brand new material, which is called Glare, which was this glass laminate aluminum reinforced epoxy, which was a sort of a hybrid between aluminum and composite, which was used in the upper fuselage and parts of the leading edges. And 20% of the weight, in fact, of the 380 is composite. So not 50% plus like you get today, but it was definitely a way there. The wings, we've talked about them, of course. They were again an engineering masterpiece, to be honest. They did have their issues to start with. They failed 145% of limit load, I think, during initial testing, and they did have some cracking in the early versions. But again, they got over those. But in terms of sheer size, they had to be limited to 260 feet span, this 80-meter box. So you can just imagine the sort of the infrastructure challenges that were associated with moving those sort of things around. So there's all sorts of different aspects of the A380 which have got to be applauded from an engineering perspective, and from what they achieved as a passenger experience perspective. So even though we denigrate the strategy as a whole, I think the end product certainly deserves some credit for that.
Yeah, and I would be the first person to say that Airbus has always looked forward and embraced new technology and been very innovative in their thinking and their engineering. I might not always agree with the choices that they've made, but I absolutely applaud their ambition and their vision. When we did do that one A340 hop together, I was incredibly impressed by that airplane. You may remember that the pilot actually had brain wave monitoring sensors on his head. Do you remember that he was wired as they were still capturing data from, I guess, his stress levels or reactions to various envelopes and modalities of the flight?
I must admit I'd forgotten that, but that was probably because my own brainwave monitoring was really focused on the magnificent French wine that was being served in the very few seats that were aboard that aircraft, if I remember right.
Exactly. I have a photograph. You can actually see the wiring harness coming down the back of his neck.
Really?
From where he had been wired.
But the
food was amazing.
Yeah, it was a memorable
flight. There was
flight.
a chef.
Yeah. Yes.
It was. Well, you have been incredibly kind and generous with your time, but I think I'm probably running you out of available fuel. So could you tell our audience what are some of the titles of your books and where folks might find them, even though you might be a little bashful about promoting them? I think that you're an incredible writer, so just give people a sense if they're curious to know more.
Thank you, Chris. It's very kind of you to say so. Well, the A380 book, which I published in 2005, it's an old one now, but of course it did trace very faithfully the engineering, design, and evolution of the product. It's called Airbus A380 Superjumbo of the 21st Century, published by Zenith Press, and with many gorgeous photographs by our esteemed colleague Mark Wagner, who is well known to both of us. So
amazingly talented photographer, Mark Wagner, absolutely incredible.
So thank you for that shout out. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, Craig, and I do hope you get a chance to fly on the A380. I think even though the last one is not being produced until 2021, it will be soldiering on and well into the 2030s. So even you might have a chance for that.
Even you. Wow. That stings a little bit. I think, isn't ANA still taking delivery of them right now? And
yes, indeed. Yeah, they have 3 more aircraft to be delivered, and of course Emirates still has a batch to go as well. So there's still a few to come out of the barn there in Toulouse.
Well, Airbus, if you're listening, or All Nippon Airways, if you're listening, I would love to go on one of those delivery flights and do a podcast and a feature story about it. So you know where to find me. Please get in touch. Guy, you and your colleagues at Aviation Week have been doing an incredible job covering the emerging 737 MAX story, both in the magazine and in your podcasts. Are there any special website addresses or podcast titles folks should look for to see that coverage and find your other work?
Well, yes, you're quite right. It's been a very busy month of coverage for us on that. But I would just recommend going to our website, which is just aviationweek.com. You'll be able to follow the links from there.
Okay, and where can people find and follow you online, if you'd like to share that?
Well, I'm on my Twitter handle is avweekguy. And otherwise, you could just find my material out there on the aviationweek.com website.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for joining me on this first flight of the new edition of this podcast, and new rendition, I should say, perhaps, of this podcast. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon if you'll drop that restraining order on me.
Thanks, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
Well, the wheels are stopped and the chocks are in. Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe, and we will catch you next time on The Leading Edge.
Neil, this is Houston, loud and clear.
2584, runway 24 left, clear for takeoff.
I hope you enjoyed that show, and thanks for listening. You and others in our listener crew made this episode, like all our podcasts and videos, possible. If you've not already joined, please visit aerospacenews.com/fans and make any contribution you can afford. Every bit of support helps, no matter how small. Thank you.